Muy bien, buenos días, buenas tardes. Me da mucho gusto estar aquí, darles la bienvenida aquí al CISAN. Es para mí un particular honor que el CISAN se reinserte en estos debates de defensa y seguridad. Quiero hacer un personal reconocimiento y agradecimiento al doctor Raúl Benítez por hacer posible que estas reconexiones se den. También al doctor Roberto Zepeda por toda la coordinación académica para poder hacer esto posible. Muchísimas gracias, Yadira, por venir aquí al CISAN, que es tu casa. Athanasios, bienvenido al CISAN, que sea la primera de muchas participaciones aquí. Y por supuesto, Michael, gracias por traer esta conexión tan importante para el CISAN. Esto se hace en el marco del consorcio que tiene la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México con la Universidad de Arizona y en el marco del Seminario Internacional Migración, Derechos, Humanos y Seguridad Humana. Entonces, pues eso es para nosotros muy importante retomar estos temas que se vengan a discutir al CISAN. Es parte del trabajo que queremos hacer durante esta etapa que viene. Nos espera un 2026 pues tremendo, ¿verdad? Con muchísimos elementos de complejidad en esta materia, y pues qué mejor que tener a los mejores exponentes sobre seguridad que tenemos y tenerlos aquí en el CISAN. Así que pues me da muchísimo gusto dejarlos aquí en esos trabajos. Les deseo todo lo mejor y que sea la primera de muchas actividades relacionadas con el tema. Y yo me sentaré atrás porque tendré que salir a otra actividad a la mitad, pero pues bueno, no quise dejar pasar la oportunidad de darles la bienvenida y desearles el mayor de los éxitos en este trabajo. Gracias.
Muchas gracias al doctor Juan Carlos Barrón, pastor director del Centro de Investigaciones sobre América del Norte, por dar estas palabras de bienvenida. Es también para mí un honor pues estar en este evento. Vamos a agradecerle al doctor Barrón. Sí. La Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, sí, a través del Centro de Investigaciones sobre América del Norte, el CISAN, en el marco del Consorcio Binacional Universidad de Arizona-UNAM en Migración, Derechos Humanos y Seguridad Humana, pues le estamos dando la más cordial bienvenida a esta mesa redonda, ¿no? The Fourth Annual US-Mexico Defense and Security Roundtable, con nuestro expositor magistral, el doctor Michael Burgoyne, comentarista, la doctora Yadira Gálvez, el doctor Athanasios Hristoulas y el doctor Raúl Benítez Manaut. Quisiera darle también el uso de la voz antes de empezar con esta conferencia magistral al doctor Raúl Benítez, coordinador también académico e investigador aquí del CISAN y experto en estos temas, para que nos dé unas palabras de bienvenida.
Well, I will speak in English because this will be a bilingual session. Our speaker, Michael Burgoyne, have all his students in the YouTube. It's a part of his teaching activities, and this will be very interesting. This session will be in Spanish and in English. The main presentations will be in English, but the idea is to enforce the relationship between the UNAM and the University of Arizona with this kind of activities. Many research from CISAN are going to Arizona in exchange programs, and also at the same time, many people from Arizona come to UNAM and to CISAN to enforce this relation. Mike Burgoyne is a very close friend of many people here. He knows very well Mexico. He's an expert in Arizona on the defense and security relations between Mexico and the U.S. and the U.S. and Latin America. He wrote a lot articles on these matters, on security, and we will learn a lot with Mike. Thank you very much, Mike, to be here. And thank you very much for all the people to stay here. I want to thank Alberto, the boss of the Association of Defense Attaches here in Mexico, because he invited many people here. And it's very important to have people from the diplomatic field sector here in Mexico, no? Okay, thank you very much, Roberto. Thank you very much for the director, Juan Carlos Barrón, to help to have this activity and to gather all together right now here.
Well, thank you, Raúl. It's an honor for us, for the Center for Research on North America, to host this event. And Dr. Michael Burgoyne will be the main speaker, the presenter of this session. And we will also have the participation of Yadira Gálvez as a commentator, Athanasios, Hristoulas, and Raúl Benítez, a researcher from UNAM, the Faculty of Politics and Social Science, in the case of Yadira, and Athanasios Hristoulas from ITAM, and Dr. Raúl Benítez, also from CISAN. Allow me to introduce Dr. Michael Burgoyne. He's a professor in the International Security Studies program at the University of Arizona, and he has held various positions, different positions in political and security cooperation in the Americas, working for the U.S. State Department and the U.S. embassies in Mexico and Guatemala, and also as a policy analyst at the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. And he holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Arizona and a master's degree in security studies from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He's currently completing his PhD in the war studies at King's College, London, UK. And his research focused on security in the Americas, transnational organized crime, alliance and U.S. defense policy with countries in North America and Latin America. Then we will have around 30 minutes with Michael Burgoyne presentation. Then we will have the participation of our commentators after that, and then we will have a questions period. Thank you very much, and then we can start this event.
Pues muchísimas gracias. Estoy muy feliz de estar aquí en México otra vez. Tengo muchos amigos aquí. Siempre es muy bueno. Me encanta la Ciudad de México. Y yo tengo unos días aquí y ha sido mucha diversión. Pero también yo debería decir que yo voy a hablar en inglés, like Raúl said, because hopefully everybody's still there in Tucson. And trust me, we're going to have plenty of people speaking in English. And I think on YouTube, there's a way to click a button now with AI where you can get it to auto-translate. But I don't know. I tried to figure it out myself and couldn't figure it out. So hopefully somebody can for the part where we're speaking Spanish. So this is the fourth time we've done this roundtable and made it open to the public. I started teaching the Mexico Defense and Security class back in 2016. And then I've been teaching it ever since. And that was when I was here assigned to the embassy. And I really enjoy this class. I think it's great to talk about what's going on with Mexico and the United States and our level of cooperation. This is the first time we're holding the roundtable in Mexico City. And I want to thank UNAM, the University of Arizona School of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and then also the joint consortium that we have between UNAM and the University of Arizona. Raúl mentioned it. The consortium is really, I think, very important, and it allows us to partner with UNAM, where we can bring up scholars to the University of Arizona. The consortium allowed me to come down here for this week to participate in this event and also do some research here in Mexico City. And things like the consortium are unbelievably important. And I think on the surface, sometimes people don't understand like how important the consortium is. So when Donald Trump was elected for the second time, I had a lot of people call me and say, well, what do we do? Is everything going to fall apart? What's the most important part of the relationship? And I would always tell them, I'm like, well, the most important part are those kind of bureaucratic, like not really the leadership level, right? It's not like president to president. It's not secretary to secretary. It's really like at the worker level, these kind of agreements and meetings and these kind of high level engagements where people get together and work through the details of how are we going to improve the border crossing? How are we going to improve communication? How are we going to work on our interoperability as security forces? And so all those kind of meetings, if they continue, then the relationship continues. And there's no real way to not have a relationship between the United States and Mexico. It's really more of a choice of do you want to have a bad relationship or a good relationship? And you can weather difficult political times if you have these kind of things like the Consorcio. You have things like the bilateral security meetings. These things are important. And if we continue to do those things, we can get through even the toughest periods in the bilateral relationship. So I want to say special thanks to Raúl Benítez, to Roberto Zepeda for their work organizing the event. Also back at University of Arizona, Paulette Cursor, Alex Braithwaite, Luis Coronado for their support. And then also want to thank the Tucson Committee on Foreign Relations for their continued support of the Roundtable there. So the Roundtable has always been the last event in my Mexico National Security course, and that's in the International Security Studies program at the University of Arizona. That's a master's program. And this is an opportunity for students to ask questions to panelists, and so they get different perspectives than just me talking to them. So they can ask people other things. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to set the stage and kind of provide kind of some foundational comments, and then I'll provide some questions that we can get after on the panel here. So the first one, I think what's striking about teaching a course on Mexico is that year after year, I said I've been teaching this since 2016, and so year after year, the problems just continue, and it becomes extremely depressing. Like I can really just update the number. Like I'm like, okay, how many dead this year? How many overdoses this year? I can update like how many disappeared this year. So some things change, but so many of the problems we can't seem to get a solution to. So drug overdoses in the United States have declined, but they remain an astounding 80,000 dead a year of drug overdoses in the United States. And then in Mexico, Mexico seems to have kind of plateaued out at this about 30,000 homicides every year in Mexico. Has almost become like the new normal. This is a situation that's really simply unbearable. Like all of this just seems like something we shouldn't tolerate, and yet it continues. And it continues, but there's growing cries, that something must be done. We've got to do something. We've got to do anything to fix these problems. And so the Sheinbaum administration, has shifted security policy, I think, from López Obrador's security policy. Feels like it's a little more aggressive. But even this week, I don't want to act like I'm a New York Times columnist or something, but I always talk to my Uber drivers and everybody I meet on the street. And so multiple people that I've met talking on the street, and also when I'm in the border region, this happens too. When I'm in Sonora, I'm like, hey, what do you think? What's going on? A lot of these people will tell me, well, what we really need is like the Bukele solution. What we need here is we need like the president of El Salvador has this hardline mano duro policy. We need a Bukele to come in and fix Mexico. And I don't think they fully understand what they're asking for there, but I think it demonstrates the level of frustration I think that's been going on. And if you look at the other side there with the Trump administration, you see also just this kind of like something must be done. We have a lot of people that have loved ones that have died of drug overdoses that are like, we have to do something. And when anyone can provide them a solution, they're going to grab onto that. So I think a lot of people, they're like, well, from Mexico, we need this Bukele solution. We need this like hard-hitting solution. And I think that maybe what the Trump administration wants Mexico to do as well, I think they want like a different level of action against the cartels than what's been going on for several years now. But at the same time, if you look at the Trump administration, they've cut drug prevention programs, they've cut gut treatment programs, and they've really opted for this kind of supply side and interdiction approach that they're going after, supply. And we've kind of turned our backs on everything that we've been doing lately on demand. So some of that's still going on, but that the trend in policy is we're going to go after the foreigners that are producing the drugs, and these other things in the United States aren't going to be something we're going to be focused on, or at least making a priority. So the Trump administration's embraced a new vision of border security. And that's something that we discussed last year with General Guillot when he was part of the roundtable. So General Guillot is the commander of U.S. Northern Command. And that was a really interesting panel discussion that we had. Raúl was on that panel. And, you know, there were some pretty tough questions leveled in that panel discussion. And I think we're seeing some of these things happen, you know, under the Trump administration, that there were concerns being raised about. You know, in Trump 2.0, like, they have designated the land adjacent to the border as a military installation. So this is now kind of military terrain on the north side of the border. And that can be just, you know, several, like 100 meters deep or something like that, or it can go like miles deep, depending on what terrain they've claimed as being part of the military installation. And then they've also deployed 12,500 troops to the border. Now in Trump 1.0, there were also troops on the border, but this is a little bit different this time. In Trump 2.0, you now have combat troops on the border. So you have the first deployment that went out there was an infantry brigade with their Stryker armored vehicles is now on the border, and you can see pictures of the Strykers on the border providing overwatch. And so far, the idea is that they are supporting the civilian authorities. And if you look at Northcom's statements on this, then in Joint Task Force Southern Border, it's their role in civilian support. But if you look at what's going on with the military installation, where they've done these national defense areas, I mean, the idea is that the military will be able to enforce security along the border. That's kind of where the Trump administration is going. And as far as immigration goes, like, the results have been pretty clear that the, you know, migration and illegal migration is down significantly on the border, not only for the fact that they have military there, they have increased presence, but also I think just the messaging and the psychological impact of what's going on with the migration enforcement in the United States. But Mexico also, you know, based, I think, by the pressure from the United States, they deployed on their side of the border, or Mexican side, 10,000 National Guard troops. So you really have a big influx of personnel on the border, securing the border at this point. But again, even this might not be enough. You know, we've got migrations down, we've got military forces, a large number of them on the border. But President Trump, Vice President Vance, Secretary of Defense Hegseth, have all stated that the U.S. could launch unilateral military strikes against Mexican transnational criminal organizations. I mean, this happened, I think, just even like a week ago or 2 weeks ago, the president had mentioned this. So this would be a significant event, you know, harking back to like the Pershing expedition of 1916, occupation of Veracruz in 1914, and of course the Mexican-American War. You know, and then just 2 days ago, and I'll say it's the other thing that's interesting about teaching a class on Mexican national security and also preparing for this event is that you have to watch the news because things change as you're writing your commentary. So just 2 days ago, the White House announced the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And it says this, and I'll say, you know, from my perspective, having recently spent a lot of time studying the inter-American system, the Monroe Doctrine, all of these things, it's a fairly ahistorical understanding of what the Monroe Doctrine is and what it means and what the situation and how the United States has looked at the region since the Monroe Doctrine when it was stated. But anyway, the new doctrine that just came out is that, and I'll quote it here, is that the American people, not foreign nations nor globalist institutions, will always control their own destiny in our hemisphere. So in some ways, this is an even more forceful announcement than what you had with the Roosevelt corollary in the beginning of the 20th century, which basically said that if European powers were coming in and they wanted to enforce debts or something like this, they would not do that. The United States would enforce those debts for them. So that was certainly interventionist, but this is something entirely, it really is a turn away from the good neighbor policy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And it's a turn away from what happened in 1947, 1948 with the foundation of the Rio Treaty and also the Organization of American States, which pointed to a new vision for how the hemisphere would work. And it wouldn't be based on the United States doing unilateral action in the hemisphere. So this is a big change from what really has been the policy for a long time with some noted exceptions. So that's what we've got now is the Trump corollary that was announced a couple of days ago. But President Sheinbaum has been fairly consistent with her statements that Mexico would work with the United States, but that the violation of Mexican sovereignty would be unacceptable, a red line. And unilateral strikes or any rupture of relations has the potential to be immensely disruptive given the close economic ties between the two countries. So $1.5 million crosses the US-Mexico border every minute in commerce. I mean, so even if you just have a break in commerce for days or weeks, the impact economically just grows and grows and becomes really substantial. So there's a lot of risk with unilateral strikes. There's a lot of risk with causing any kind of rupture in the bilateral relationship. And then finally, I think we need to talk about Mexico's place in the world and in the region. And I think sometimes, especially in the United States scholars and a lot of folks that work on policy, they get very focused on the bilateral and they don't think about where Mexico fits globally and where Mexico fits as a major power. And a lot of times people don't think of Mexico, if they haven't thought a lot about Mexico, as a G20 country and a major player globally and especially in the region. But so I think we have to ask ourselves, given the Trump corollary, given the recent deployment of a large naval force in the Caribbean, how is Mexico going to react if U.S. action against Venezuela escalates? What's Mexico's way of dealing with it? And I think it's a very tough question, right? I mean, if you're President Sheinbaum, if you're the Mexican government, you really want to continue with the free trade agreement with the United States. You want to try to manage this kind of risk of unilateral action from the United States and and I think President Sheinbaum would want to continue her policy of managing President Trump. But at the same time, you have some long-term kind of a different standing there, a relationship with Venezuela and some other parties in the region. So how do you manage that? And I think there's also that two-level game going on there where you have domestic concerns involved with this foreign policy issue to deal with. So I think that's an interesting question also. Like, what happens if we escalate in Venezuela, which, could happen while we're talking today, who knows? I think more generally, Mexico's facing this kind of new multipolar environment. And I think we're attempting to manage its relations with the United States and other powers has become, more complex. You saw during the Cold War, this kind of Caribbean three-step. Some of that still continues today with like assistance to Cuba. Is that foreign policy going to hold up? Is it still current? Does it still make sense? Because I think if you look at what's going on in the United States with like Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and also the National Security Advisor, which is a tremendous position of power that really we're talking about since Kissinger, where you've had this kind of level of consolidation of authority in the national security space in the United States. I think if you look at what Marco Rubio's stance has been towards Cuba, towards Nicaragua, towards Venezuela, it's very clear, that he's going to not have a very positive view of Mexico continuing to support Cuba. And so I think all these things kind of run into each other. And so I think Mexico's facing some really difficult problem sets in the international arena as well. And a lot of these things come, and it's very hard to keep these things separated. So I think it's very interesting to find out, like, how is Mexico to manage this? How is the U.S. going to deal with its interest in Mexico when we've got all these different things coming together, foreign policy, bilateral policy, and then also domestic issues. So with that lead in, what I'd like to do is provide some questions from my students. So like I said, my students are master's students. Most of them already work in defense or law enforcement or intelligence, or they're mid-career. Most of them are like mid-career professionals working on their master's program. So hopefully what we can do as we're talking is maybe just work some of these answers into there and try to figure out like where we can fit in some comments. And I think naturally we'll get to it anyway, but I'll break them into some categories. So the first one, so Mexico internal security. So Riley Josephs asks, given current levels of cartel fragmentation and territorial competition, what institutional reforms are most urgent for improving Mexico's intelligence, investigative, and prosecutorial capacities? And then we've got Angelina De Leon and David Deckers. They both asked about technology. And this is an interesting one because there's some great folks, primarily in California there, like John Sullivan and Dr. Bunker. They're at Small Wars Journal in the El Centro page on Small Wars Journal. You can find their work on kind of the increase in the number of drones and different technologies that the cartels are using. So they ask, what should the U.S. and Mexico do to keep up and adapt as cartels adopt drones, encryption, other new technologies? And as I look at what's going on with this kind of this engagement we're doing, where it's all about interdiction, I think one thing that's proven to be basically a fact in the counter drug arena is that whatever you do, like there's competition there and it's a market. And so you're going to have drug traffickers are going to figure out other ways to get drugs into the United States. So will that be, drones? Is that going to be, perhaps it could be maritime drones? We've seen a lot of innovation of that going on in Ukraine. And they've already proven to be very innovative here in this hemisphere with semi-submersibles, fully submersibles loaded with drugs. So, I think this is a really good question. And then you've also seen in Michoacan and some of the states here in Mexico where the cartels are using drones for offensive warfare, very similar to what's going on in Ukraine. And there's also reporting about, Ukrainian know-how showing up here in Mexico, which could be really deadly and really dangerous because hardly anybody knows how to deal with the drone threat, including the United States and certainly here in Mexico. So if that gets elevated, that could be a huge problem. Brianna Arizmendi, she says, President Sheinbaum was believed to follow in the steps of her predecessor, but a common opinion is that she has deviated. What has changed under President Sheinbaum in relation to security and foreign relations? And what do you predict will change under her presidency? And then regarding unilateral action, Jacob Baker asks, or he says here, Sheinbaum said in her State of the Nation address earlier this year, and I quote, under no circumstance will we accept interventions, interference, or any other act from abroad that is detrimental to the integrity, independence, and sovereignty of the country, end quote. So Baker says, to what extent can Mexico's longstanding strategy of cooperating with the United States while maintaining firm red lines remain sustainable amid renewed tariff threats and potential unilateral U.S. actions under the Trump administration? And I think really, I've been surprised. I think with the Trump administration talking to some security forces folks in Mexico, I think, to a certain extent, the pressure, I don't want to say that it's welcome, but this idea that, we need to get after the cartels more, I think that's something that is floating around here in Mexico, that the pressure is good because we can do it. But I also think at the same time, there's like a limit, like at some point, if the U.S. takes certain action, it violates sovereignty, what does that do? And so I think it's an interesting question, how firm are those red lines? And then what do we do about them if they get crossed? And then how can President Sheinbaum and her administration keep Trump and his administration happy enough where none of those red lines are crossed? And then Ryan Dickerson asked a question about China. Mexico's growing economic engagement with China, especially in critical infrastructure like communications and technology, raises potential security risks and could be a point of friction with the U.S. in the future. What is the way ahead to deter the potential security risk? And I know I'm sure we have some Chinese diplomats that would say, hey, this isn't a problem. We've got a good positive presence here. But I think in the United States, China has been the pacing threat. It's been described as the pacing threat to the United States. So I think the security foundation, the security infrastructure in the United States is looking for, okay, what inroads is China making into Latin America, especially Mexico is very sensitive. And so how is Mexico going to manage that? Or at a minimum, manage U.S. expectations for what Mexico should be doing about dealing with not just China, but China, Russia, these other kind of great powers. Great power competition is kind of in vogue in Washington, D.C. And then on U.S.-Mexico security cooperation, you got Jeremiah Arguello. He says, how can the U.S. and Mexico jointly address the expanding role of Chinese suppliers in cartel drug production? Which this has been something that's been going on for a long time, about trying to coordinate with China about how they label and deal with precursor chemicals, how they enforce fentanyl and trafficking, movement of fentanyl and other precursors from China into Mexico. And then Mexico, how it's going to deal with the movement of precursors into Mexico. And then Alejandro Gonzalez Santiago, as Mexican cartels increasingly exploit weaken local governance, expand into extortion-based economies, and deploy military-grade technology, what sustainable model of cooperation could both nations adopt that balances Mexico's autonomy with the urgent need for coordinated action against transnational criminal networks? So I think this builds on a reoccurring theme here about how can we continue to work together. And then John Bryant from Tucson Committee on Foreign Relations, he asked what's being done about weapons trafficking. We actually had Ion Grillo up at University of Arizona, I guess it was probably a year ago, and he was talking about his new book, or I guess it was new then, about weapons trafficking. And, Mexico has these cases that are still moving through the system in the United States. University of Arizona is located in Tucson, Arizona. Tucson, Arizona has 3 of the gun stores that are part of this case that Mexico's brought against the weapons dealers and these stores, saying that they're deliberately or knowingly providing weapons to cartels. So I think this is an interesting one, you know, like what's being done about weapons trafficking, what more could be done. And then finally, Andrew Mays, I thought had a really good question. And this is one that I don't think enough people ask. You know, what would success look like in the long term? You know, beyond seizures of drugs, arrests of cartel members, you know, that will ensure stability. You know, what would long-term stability look like? How do you build trust with the Mexican people? And when I talk to folks about strategy, when I'm teaching strategy, I talk a lot about, you know, how do you see the world now, and how do you see the world as you want it to be? And it feels like in the U.S.-Mexico security relationship, a lot of times we're dealing with the problem right in front of us. It's like, how can we arrest this cartel member? How can we seize these drugs? You know, how can we improve some movement along the border? And all of things are good, and it gets us moving in the right direction. But I think sometimes we're like, well, where are we going? What would we like this relationship to look like? What would we like the security relationship to look like? And I think if we don't have a clear vision of that, it's kind of hard to get there. And some of these problems are like endemic. These are problems that don't really get solved ever to a certain extent. You know, what do we want to see drug use in the United States look like? Like, what is a tolerable level of drug use? What is a level of drug use we can manage and deal with? And then in Mexico, you know, what is a level of security for our people that is something that is in a range of acceptable that we're going to be able to work with? And then I think what comes out of that is that if you could figure out where you want to be, you could figure out, like, well, how can we work together to make this happen? And I remember when I first started dealing with Mexico and also with Latin America, I think it was the Wilson Center had a book that they came out with called, you know, shared responsibility. And that was the buzzword. Like, that was like, everybody was like, shared responsibility. Well, we're going to do this with shared responsibility. We're going to respect sovereignty, shared responsibility. And I think we are a long way from shared responsibility. But I mean, from where I'm sitting, I feel like, you know, if we can't figure out what our shared interests are, what our shared vision of the future is, and we're not willing to accept shared responsibility on how we're going to get there, I think we're just going to be kind of locked in this situation. And every year when I go through the slides of my class and my notes, I'm just going to keep updating those numbers, and we're just going to keep doing this forever. And I think that the real losers in that are the citizens of both countries that are suffering from violence and drug overdoses and everything that comes out of that. And also all the loss in commerce and, you know, well-being of the entire population. Because the better security we have, the better our economies are going to be, and the better everything's going to get. But we just can't, at least for several years now, we've had a real hard time getting there. So I'm hoping that we can maybe get to that eventually. But I don't have a good answer for Andrew. Maybe somebody here does. But that's what I've got. So hopefully that gets us started on the discussion. And thanks so much again to UNAM for having me here.
Well, many thanks, Michael. Presentation was very clear. And now I'm going to switch to Spanish. Vamos a escuchar ahora los comentarios de la doctora Yadira Gálvez, profesora asociada de tiempo completo, adscrita al Centro de Relaciones Internacionales de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales de la UNAM y coordinadora académica del proyecto de investigación Los regionalismos frente a los retos y la complejidad de las amenazas a la seguridad y defensa contemporáneas 2 de la UNAM. Miembro del Sistema Nacional de Investigadoras e Investigadores, nivel 1, la doctora Gálvez ha sido profesora visitante del Centro William Perry de Estudios Hemisféricos de la Defensa de la Universidad Nacional de Defensa de Estados Unidos, miembro del colectivo de análisis para la seguridad y democracia y de la International Studies Association, de LASA y de AMEI. También fue de la AMEI, donde es actualmente vicepresidenta de la mesa directiva. Forma parte de la red de expertos internacionales asociados al Centro de Estudios Estratégicos del Ejército de Perú, analista de asuntos internacionales en diversos medios de comunicación. Escuchamos a la doctora Yadira Gálvez.
Muchísimas gracias, querido doctor. Solo nada más comentar que el proyecto ahora está en otra etapa, porque ahora estoy en el Seminario de Relaciones, en el Seminario de Política Exterior de México, pero es todo. Thank you very much. I'm gonna do that in English and also in Spanish. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to share this space with my appreciated colleagues, I'm grateful to the North American Research Center, our CISAN, and also the University of Arizona for this invitation. I'd like to express my appreciation for the strategic partnership between our national university and the University of Arizona through the Binacional Consortium and the International Seminar of Migration and Human Security. Professor Burgoyne, Michael, welcome back to Mexico. Friends of us, your presentation offers highly valuable elements for analyzing and understanding the complexities of the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States. Your perspective is particularly meaningful given your experience and understanding of both worlds, academia, where you now work, and public service. Few people as familiar as you with the multiple dimension and challenge that define the US-Mexico relationship. And I'm certain that you could share countless lessons learned and recommendations for both governments and also academia. Allow me to highlight 4 elements that emerge from your remarks. First of all, the need to think comprehensively about the fight against criminal organizations and networks, and also about the lessons learned about the strategies implemented until now. In the case of Mexico, for example, it's clear that the politicization of militarization of public security has not been the solution. Second, the implications of the new securitization process of illegal drugs and criminal organizations, now including the designations of all well-known Mexican criminal groups as a terrorist organizations and the operational, diplomatic, and legal consequences of such shift, including, of course, the actions undertaken by the Department of War as a part of its response to this evolving threat. Third, the dimension to which the new war on drugs has taken in the broader context of strategic and geopolitical competitions, thinking about US-China relations, but also US-Russia relations, and the repositioning of the United States in the hemisphere. What is changing? What remains the same? Both in the approach of these organizations and more specifically in the operational practice and political narratives that shape the Mexico-US relationship. Thinking about the Trump corollary, I wonder what Mexico will do. I think we must consider all the problems around our foreign policy, the breakdown relations with Ecuador, the problems currently with Peru. What we will do? I really don't know. Therefore, you said Mexico is a middle power. Whatever, I wonder if the president really assumed all the power that Mexico has. Also, I don't know. 4, your presentations invite us and remarks about importance to think our relationship, the cooperation, the bilateral cooperation outside the classic box, considering all the agencies and persons involved, and also rethinking the meaning of the shared responsibility, including the present and the future of our countries. It is very important to point out in this kind of remarks. So, in the framework of the North American Regional Security Complex, our bilateral relationships has long been characterized by dynamics of action and reaction. Nowadays, these dynamics has been taking a new momentum the Trump administration employs pressures on Mexico through multiple instruments of national powers. Everyone knows it. Mexico reacts. Its strength, its own security strategy, moves away from the abrazos no balazos strategy, also acknowledge challenge related to fentanyl productions in our country, intensifies anti-drugs operations, and once again, targets priority objectives. Once again. In this context, what we are witnessing an ongoing reconfiguration of bilateral cooperation. And I wonder, what will be the future of our bilateral cooperation? What kind of cooperation? One on the basis of both interests of Mexico and the United States? Or one just thinking about the pressures that exerts the United States under Mexico? Well, thinking about your presentation, I think that we share a border and we share threats. However, our governments do not necessarily share perspectives, nor do they prioritize the same actions in confronting this challenge. As you have noted, the United States is essential to reduce domestic consumption and dismantle the networks operating within his territory. Both the DA and the FBI have pointed out to street gangs, for example. What is the future about this strategy, this Trump strategy? What do you think about this strategy of Trump?
Yeah, about the internal gangs.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not I don't have an in-depth knowledge of what we're doing as far as internal security goes. What I've been hearing is that a lot of folks in law enforcement that usually would be solely focused on things like counter-espionage, counter-terrorism. They'd be building cases, like larger cases for counter-drug type activity. A lot of law enforcement has been diverted or given extra duty to do things like walk a beat in Washington, D.C., or do kind of do operations to try to round up migrants with ICE. So I don't know that we have a very well-formed internal domestic security policy that would affect what's going on in Mexico and our relationship with Mexico. What I think that we would need to do, or haven't ever written this paper or this book about what should be the policy. People sometimes ask me, but it really is a multifaceted problem. So if we want to reduce drug overdoses, if we want to reduce kind of homelessness, if we want to deal with gang violence and some of these things in our cities, that probably requires a pretty comprehensive plan, and it needs to be tailored to each city that you're going to work in, or each county, or everywhere you're at. But I haven't seen a fully formed strategy in the United States. I mean, as I was talking about the two different, how we have to partner and have shared responsibility, I mean, it really is it's not fathomable to me where you have things like the Culicanazo in Mexico, and you've got 50 vehicles running around with 50 caliber machine guns, and somehow this is not a security threat that's a threat to the nation itself. So you have this problem in Mexico. In the United States, you have this overdoses, homelessness, and all these things. And so both of these require comprehensive solutions, but on both sides of the border. And if you work effectively on both sides, you'll get a positive effect on both sides, because they're symbiotic. And so I think something we want to look at, say, Tucson, where the University of Arizona is. How do we bring in federal support, healthcare assistance, education, and then pair that with local law enforcement and initiatives at the local, the city and county level? How do you bring together a comprehensive strategy there to try to reduce drug use and the movement of drugs in the city? And there's a lot of people that have worked on this. There are answers. One thing that's nice, you mentioned my time in academia, but also in actually working on some of these problem sets. One thing that I've learned from pairing academic work with practical work, with practitioner work, is that someone somewhere has spent their entire life studying this problem set. So if you can put those people together and say, here's my problem, you can find really innovative and excellent solutions. But I just don't I think, at least for the last several years, we've been looking for the easy button. And I don't think, like I said, I haven't looked in depth about what the current administration is doing as far as their domestic plan. But I don't think I'm seeing anything like I would want to see in the United States.
Oh, thank you, Professor. But we have another side of the problem, that it is the violence in Mexico. We are facing a critical moment for our national security, because in Michoacan and Sinaloa, real battles are taking place. Irregular hybrid wars characterized by firepower, territorial control, criminal governance, exercised by these organizations. But the problem is that the Mexican government doesn't recognize the situation. And I wonder what will happen about designation of the Trump administration, because the debate it is not simple, because it is not insignificant to label this organization as a terrorist organization. The Trump administration's decisions to designate these criminal organizations as terrorist entities is highly symbolic, elevating the level of threat and also the between Mexico and the United States. And I wonder, what is your opinion about this? How it will impact our relationships?
The terrorist designation thing is interesting, because I think a lot of people don't understand. So the statute, the legal statute, when you designate, the State Department designates a group of foreign terrorist organization. And there are certain repercussions of that. You can go after their money. There's certain things you can do legally to go after this group. But it does not come with an authorization for the use of military force. That's not part of the legislation. But the administration has been asserting, no one's quite sure, because the actual legal documents, the justification for the actions that are happening in the Caribbean, for the direct strikes, the lethal strikes against the drug boats in the Caribbean, Congress has seen some of that, but the actual legal justification, as far as I know, has not been made public, and nobody knows exactly what the justification is. So the groups that have been, and I was asked this question just the other day, I was talking to someone at the Arizona Daily Star about this, about, well, if we've named these groups terrorist organizations outside of Venezuela, and we're doing lethal strikes there, what's stopping us from doing lethal strikes in Mexico? And my answer is, well, as far as this administration is concerned, really nothing. I mean, so, the legal basis, there's no congressional authorization to conduct the strikes outside of Venezuela. We're already well past the 60-day war powers resolution that Congress put in place, where operations after 60 days are no longer authorized, and the president is supposed to request an authorization from Congress before he continues. So yeah, I mean, the question is, like, so if the United States has a drug trafficking target in Mexico, the same legal argument that's being made by the administration would stand. That would be what they would present, and then they would conduct a strike in Mexico. And the question I've been asked is, well, what's the difference? Why aren't we doing that in Mexico yet? And I think really we have President Sheinbaum's done a pretty good job at managing the administration. I think you see Secretary Garcia Harfuch has launched a pretty aggressive campaign against the narco traffickers, the criminal organizations. And so I think what a lot of the government is hearing from Mexico is what they want to hear, and then what's coming from Mexico is what they want to hear. So we haven't seen it yet. And I think just a lot of people realize that, even though they may want to strike these groups in Mexico, if they do, there could be major repercussions. So I think unless the U.S. Congress starts to assert itself and restrict presidential authority, the only thing holding us back from unilateral strikes is the will of the president. And the way I see it, I actually wrote a short fictional piece that's on Small Wars Journal about a scenario that could lead to these kind of strikes. And I think if we have an inciting incident where somebody gets killed, there was a Marine veteran that got killed in Caborca in Sonora before President Trump took office this next time. If something like that happens again, does the president then decide to take action in Mexico? Doesn't matter what the repercussions are. So I don't know. I think the designation legally And as far as the law is concerned, it shouldn't mean anything, but the way this administration is using that designation and the way they've operated in the hemisphere so far, you could see them use that as a justification for lethal force in Mexico. So I think that's an issue. And then unless some people, and as long as people continue to convince the president and some of his close advisors that this isn't a great idea, then we won't see it. But I think the risk is certainly there.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your response. I think that for Mexico, it's essential to dismantle the macro criminal networks, and I don't know if there is political willing to do that. I think that will be a problem also with the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctora Yadira Gálvez, for his interesting comments. Vamos a presentar ahora al doctor Athanasios Hristoulas, profesor investigador del Departamento de Relaciones Internacionales del ITAM desde 1996. Su investigación principal son sobre temas de seguridad internacional, cooperación en materia de seguridad, seguridad nacional y relaciones cívico-militares. Actualmente se encuentra escribiendo el libro sobre las relaciones cívico-militares durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial, libro titulado The Politics of World War II, que está por publicarse. Además, ha sido coordinador por más de 20 años del Diplomado de Seguridad Nacional en el ITAM y es miembro nacional del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores del SNI Nivel 2.
Muchas gracias. I guess I got to switch to English straight off from the beginning. Just a footnote, I'm Canadian, so just keep that in mind. We're not the 51st state. I'm a Greek Canadian. I'm a Greek Mexican Canadian. I guess I've been here for 30 years now, so it's all kind of fuzzy for me. Thank you very much, CISAN, for inviting me to this event. Thank you, Raúl. Thank you so much as well. It's an honor to be here. I've been here quite a few other times, and it's great to be back here. I always love coming to CISAN, and it's great to see Mike and Shelley again. It's been about 3 years or 4 years, I think. Saw you guys in Arizona for your retirement. I was there for that. Had a good time. And so what I wanted to do, I was listening to what you were saying and the questions you were that your students were asking or your class participants were asking, and I wanted to set up maybe some comments or complementary ideas to your comments and address maybe some of the comments that the students were making. So one of the issues that kept on coming up is the issue of cooperation between Mexico and Canada. And again, I have to tell you, I'm gonna frame this from a Canadian perspective because I'm still Canadian. So something that we haven't talked about, and something that wasn't mentioned either by you or anybody in the discussion comments is the way that we frame our problems in the bilateral relationship. So what do I mean by that? Is that, and I'm going to use the Canadian example as a counter example. You know, in the Canada-U.S. case, security issues are maybe still sort of depends, but certainly were looked at from a common perspective. In other words, both countries saw the problem as a common problem and that they had to cooperate in order to manage that problem. Now, and those problems could have been internal, meaning within the North American region, or they could have been external. But most of them were definitely external. So Canada and the U.S. learned to kind of view things from a very cooperative point of view as far as security issues are concerned. I don't see that. I've been here for 30 years. I don't see that on the Mexican side, Mexico-U.S. side. What I've seen in the last 30 years on the Mexico-U.S. side is that Mexico blames the U.S. and the U.S. blames Mexico. And it's a convenience argument. In other words, it's an argument based on supply and demand. So when Mexico wants to blame the United States, it makes the argument about the supply of weapons. And when the United States wants to make the argument about blaming Mexico, it's about the supply of drugs coming from Mexico. And then when Mexico wants to blame them, the other way around, when the Mexicans want to argue with respect to the issue of the consumption of drugs in the United States, it's a demand argument all of a sudden. So Mexico switches from supply argument to a demand argument. And then the US does exactly the same thing as well. Well, the guns are coming into Mexico because there is a demand. So both sides can't get beyond the supply demand kind of economic argument. And we use it against each other. And it hasn't served us for a century. It certainly hasn't served us in the last 30 or 40 years or the last 15 or 20 years. But there's a very notable absence of shared responsibility, that these are common threats. The cartels are a common threat. The drugs are a common threat. The deaths in the US are a common threat. The guns in Mexico are a common threat. That's how things would have been framed in the Canada-US example. And you know, I've made this argument in other contexts, and people often will say that, well, Canada-US is different because Canada is, we speak English and we're white. No, it's not about that. I'm not going to get into the reasons because I'm going to run out of time. But if anybody wants to explain to you why it's not about language and race it really has very little to do about that. So I'm going to throw that on the table on the issue of cooperation. How we frame these issues is very different from other examples. Even the Europeans frame it from a common perspective, as opposed to blaming the other side. And that's unique in the Mexican, that's unique, honestly, that where you have two countries that face a common security threat, which is drugs and weapons and organized crime. Let's just put organized crime, that there isn't a lack of cooperation. It's a unique example. Me cuesta trabajo. It's very difficult to me to think of cases where you do have other situations where the countries are facing common threats and that they don't recognize that it's a common threat. It's something that's oddly unique to the Mexico-US relationship. I'm sure somebody can think of an exception to this, and they'll get me on it in a minute or so. But we'll just leave that. The common feature not necessarily that. On one of the other comments that was made, or one of the other subjects that was brought up, was here's a good example on, and this is going to get me in trouble, but remember, I'm Canadian and I'm Greek. The lawsuits. I mean, that's a perfect example. Excuse me, that's a perfect example of Mexico blaming the United States, right? But let's assume that Mexico wins these lawsuits. Is it going to actually change anything? Is it going to stop the weapons? I don't think so. I mean, part of the lawsuit is about, putting a scorpion on a handgun or something like that, and that they're purposely designing these weapons to be bought by cartels. So what? Are the cartels going to stop buying the handgun or the whatever because it doesn't have a scorpion? I mean, at the end of the day, is the lawsuit actually going to serve any real purpose, assuming that Mexico wins? I mean, in my mind, and remember, I'm Canadian and I'm Greek, this seems to be more about domestic public opinion rather than a real way to tackle the issue. And I know that's going to get me in trouble, but I'm notoriously always getting myself in trouble. With regards to the issue of it came up throughout the conversation. It was we kind of closed up with this was the possibility of what's going to happen in terms of what's going on with Venezuela and Mexico. And I'm actually kind of cautiously optimistic in the sense that I don't think the U.S. is going to apply the same kind of strategy that it's applying to Venezuela. And one reason is, and I think it's the most important reason, is because the reason why the U.S. is doing what it's doing in Venezuela has nothing to do with drugs. I think it has to do with China, is my sense. And we'll get to that in a moment. I do want to say some comments about that. There's another really important reason, which is that Mexico is not Venezuela. Mexico and the United States have a history of cultural, political, social, economic relations. Mexico is a huge country. This is just, I just can't see that happen. So, I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic. I think what's likely to happen is, pre-AMLO, when AMLO came in, a lot of the mechanisms that were in place kind of started falling apart. And they're starting to come back now under Sheinbaum. And what I suspect will happen is that the U.S. is going to pressure Mexico into cooperating to bring back what was there before AMLO was there, before AMLO came into to the presidency and kind of wrecked the relationship. And I'm not saying he's the only one who's responsible for wrecking the relationship. Part of it had to do with Trump 1.0 as well. AMLO really didn't help with respect to mutual cooperation or cooperation, U.S.-Mexico cooperation. I think that's something that people should be thinking about, the impact that AMLO's presidency had on the bilateral relationship, the bilateral security cooperation relationship. And I'll finish on this if I can get a couple of minutes. This idea of the Monroe Doctrine, it's more and more people are talking about the Trump Doctrine, and they've called it the Dunroe Doctrine. What I think I'm seeing, and I made these comments last week at the foreign ministry, was that, I think the way Trump sounds he sounds more and more like a 19th century type imperialist rhetoric, where it's about agreements between countries rather than let's say the rule of international law, so to speak. And he's kind of set up in his mind that there are three empires. There's the American Empire, which is the Western Hemisphere. There is the Russian Empire, which, if you think back to your history, the empires kind of tolerated the territory that each other had, and they accepted it. And if you think of it in terms of this perspective, and I'm not saying I'm right, if he is thinking like this, like a 19th century imperialist or imperial policies, then his ambivalence towards NATO and Eastern Europe and Russia and Ukraine makes 100% sense. And it doesn't mean that NATO is dead. It just doesn't mean I don't think that Article 5 is going to be there for sure. I think NATO is a partnership that the United States is going to continue, and the U.S. is going to use it when it needs it. But if it's not useful, then it's not going to be used. Very 19th century kind of imperialism. The third empire in his vision, I think, is the Chinese Empire, which in his mind is probably the one that represents the biggest threat to him, or represents the biggest threat to the United States. And because that's the empire that has a direct, or has been having a direct impact in Latin America, precisely because the United States under previous administrations has generally ignored Latin America, and China has taken up the slack. And the Venezuela in particular has particularly close relationships with China. And this is why I think we're seeing what we're seeing with regards to Maduro. It has to do with China much more than with drugs. Certainly has nothing to do with fentanyl, because fentanyl isn't coming in from if the issue is fentanyl, then he should be bombing Mexico. He shouldn't be bombing what supposedly are Venezuelan boats. I think this goes to this vision of empires. One more minute, so a couple of questions were on like what Mexico can do or what we can do. Number one, internal affairs. There is a fundamental lack of functional internal affairs institutions in this country. This is among law enforcement, and this is among the military forces as well. So much progress could be made if we just did that. And then I'll finish with this. People mentioned about, what kind of new technologies we can use and how drones and go after the money. This is the one thing that the two countries don't seem to have done over the last 30 years. We don't go after the money. These cartels are all about money. And instead of going after the money, what do? We send 20,000 soldiers to the border. We have policies of, expected attacks against cartels. Go after the money. These cartels will crash almost immediately. This is not necessarily directed against anybody per se, but perhaps these could be viewed as alternative approaches to some of the problems that the two countries are facing. I'll leave it with those thoughts. Thank you.
Muchas gracias al doctor Athanasios. Many thanks, Dr. Athanasios, for your comments. El doctor Raúl Benítez Manaut es investigador adscrito al área de estudios regionales e interregionales en CISAN-UNAM y profesor de posgrado en estudios en relaciones internacionales de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales de la UNAM. Fue presidente de la organización no gubernamental Colectivo de Análisis de la Seguridad con Democracia. Tiene estudios de licenciatura en Sociología en la UNAM, de maestría en Economía y Política Internacional en el CIDE y de doctorado en Estudios Latinoamericanos por la UNAM. Ha sido profesor de la Universidad de Columbia en Nueva York, de la Universidad Americana de Washington y del Centro de Estudios Hemisféricos de la Defensa de la Universidad Nacional de la Defensa de Estados Unidos. Fue investigador visitante del Woodrow Wilson Center en Washington, D.C. entre 1998 y 2003. Ha sido profesor de la Universidad para la Paz, San José, Costa Rica, la Universidad Iberoamericana, el ITAM, la Universidad Anáhuac, el Centro de Estudios Superiores Navales, el Instituto Matías Romero y el Colegio de Defensa Nacional. Adelante, doctor Raúl.
Thank you, Roberto, for the introduction. I will speak in English and in Spanish, mixing the ideas. I want to start with the ideas of Athanasios talking about Canada because we don't speak a lot on this issue, but Canada is very far from Mexico. I think the FTA agreement between the three countries, but in other dimension, the issue with Canada. Mexico and Canada has more problems with the agreement, and in the years of the agreement in security field are very far one for another than in the past. For example, the issue of the visas, the transit of the people. Before the NAFTA, the Mexicans can go to Canada without visa. With the NAFTA, the Mexicans need visa.
Yeah, but I wasn't talking about Mexico, Canada.
Yeah. But for example, what is the Canada-US defense and security relations? The Canada-US is very important because Canada is an strategic partner of the US because the NORAD and because the role of Canada in the defense of the US territory in the face of the Cold War and the issue of missiles and etc. Mexico and the US is for the domestic politics in Mexico and the weakness of the Mexican national security issues. It's totally different. The security relation, I think, we can debate. We debate a lot with Saki. Saki es muy buen debatidor de estos asuntos, pero yo creo que Canadá y México están más alejados ahora que antes. Y creo que el próximo año se va a demostrar. Canadá no quiere el Tratado de Libre Comercio. Es muy poca la relación comercial entre México y Canadá comparada con la relación comercial México y Canadá. No, but the security in common. Canada and the United States, the relation is very strong. The US and Mexico is very strong, but between Mexico and Canada, not. Okay. For defense and security. The next year, I think the focus on the US-Mexico relations will be the free trade agreement. This year was the issue of drug trafficking and the migration issue. I think the most important thing will change very fast to the negotiations of trade. And for the Mexican government, it's very difficult to negotiate with the United States because Donald Trump mixed trade with other things that the weakness of the Mexican state. So someday in the same speech of Donald Trump, he said, "I love the Claudia Sheinbaum. She's a very nice president, very good, strong, etc., etc." In the same speech, he said, 40% of the Mexican land is leading by the cartels. In the same. With this kind of speech, it's very difficult for the Mexican government to have a coherence in the relations. It's only defensive relations reacting with the US movements around the world. I think Mexico is very weak around the world. Mexico, for me, my friends in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and don't agree with me, but Mexico don't have foreign policy. Mexico in Latin America don't have any kind of foreign policy and has many problems in Latin America. It's very alone. Mexico is more or less than in the Cold War. For example, in the Cold War, Mexico has no relations with two countries in the world, with Spain and with Chile by Pinochet government. Right now has broken the relations with Ecuador and Peru. And the next year, we have a coincidence of the expansion of the governments in South America and Central America who came from the right. And Mexico don't want this. And the US policy towards South America and in particular with Venezuela, the US government is trying to cut the relations between Mexico and Venezuela with Cuba. And Mexico will do that because if the Mexican government don't do that, we don't have trade agreement. This will be clear. If the issue of the oil, the issue of the doctors, the Mexican government is in face of the wall with the speech of the United States towards the issue, the crisis in Venezuela, and also the way that the US is looking the Cuban crisis. I think the Cuban crisis, we don't know nothing about the US policy during the first year of Donald Trump towards Cuba because they don't say nothing. Donald Trump don't mention Cuba. I think Donald Trump don't knows the name of the president of Cuba, I think. And Marco Rubio is the same, but Marco Rubio knows the name of the president of Cuba. But I think don't mention nothing is kind of policy to one country, is to put pressure to Venezuela and to put pressure to Mexico to don't have relations with Cuba in the field of the oil and in the field of the supporting the Cuban government. And I think Donald Trump will win this position because Mexico is very weak to negotiate something with the United States, except how to deal with the free trade issues. Well, for the security, the key question, my guess, is the different perception of for example, the criminal organizations and how they work in the world. The US perception is a triangle. What kind of the triangle? The anti-terrorist and anti-organized crime war is in three dimensions. The base is the soldiers, the fight, the combats. For example, in the case of Mexico, the fight between the Mexican Army and the Mexican Navy with the drug traffickers. The other side is the laundry money, the responsibility of the business people in the issue of the laundry money from the drugs cartels and the associations between governors, business people, etc., with the cartels. And the third one is the corruption. Mexico don't share this perception and don't combat the two last issues. Mexico only made the combat with the traffickers in the field of the labor of the Army and the Navy. And it's very weak, Mexico, in the field of the combat the laundry money issue and the corruption system. But the US pressure is put pressure on that to matters. I think the US government has reason. And it's not Trump perception, it's the whole US political system view of Mexico. The Democrats is exactly the same. Exactly the same. They say, well, the politicians, the corruption, etc. The business community is working together with the organized crime. It's not a one party perception. It's the whole US political system, the way that they view Mexico. And the Mexicans only fight the organized crime with militaries, combating militaries in the streets, not in the banks, not in the fiscal issue. And with this, for example, the Mexican officials don't know what is the most important intelligence service in the world. It's not the CIA, not the FBI, not the DIA, etc. It's the IRS in the United States. And the IRS is looking the way that the business community in Mexico is helping the drug traffickers. And the Mexican IRS, SAT, don't know nothing about that, or don't want to know nothing, or they put in the desk the files. This different perception is very difficult to have good relations in real terms. At the level of the speeches of the presidents, the relations are very good. But when you go down, the relation is terrible. The differences in the relation is terrible. And one of the best part of the Mexican institutions to fight the drugs traffickers in the past, the Mexican Navy, shows corruption at the same time with the oil issue, the oil crisis. Because of this, the US can have tools to pressure the Mexican government. And with this will be in the table of negotiations for the trade. And I don't want to debate that, I think. Okay. The Prime Minister of Canada, Mr. Carney, is one of the most successful people who knows on economy in the world. He was the boss of the England Bank and the boss of the Canadian Bank. He knows very well the trade issue, and to negotiate with the United States, he has all the tools. And Canada don't have the problems of corruption. Canada don't have the problems of drug trafficking in the field of the cartels. They have problems with the drug trafficker issue at the level of consumption, the addicts, etc. But that's it. And Canada has the doors open to other parts of the world in trade issues. Mexico, no. Mexico is very close for that. Mexico don't have trade with any country of Latin America in the matter of free trade. Don't have free trade agreements with South America, with Central America, with any country, etc., etc. Only has the door open with the United States. And in the diplomatic field, the conditions of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are terrible. We don't have diplomacy, on diplomacy, to have opens, to have the door opens in other countries. With Brazil, only Claudia Sheinbaum and Lula have more similar ideologies, but Brazil defends its country with the multilateralism outside the continent. Brazil works in Asia and Africa with BRICS, etc., etc. Mexico don't have any kind of this way out. And for me, this is a problem, because how we will negotiate the NAFTA and what will be the conditions of the negotiation of the free trade. Donald Trump said yesterday, the free trade is in danger. Yes, he said that. And it's true. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, the changes in the people inside the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the last week goes to the free trade. The new boss of the Minister of Foreign Affairs is an expert on free trade, not in diplomacy, not in multilateralism, etc. Is to put all the people in the Mexican government to work to save the free trade. But the problem is not in the negotiations table. The problem is in the streets. Donald Trump said, and has many reasons, Mexico don't control the public safety and the violence of the criminal organizations in the streets. And this is a big problem for the Mexican government because the Mexican government is weak to negotiate with the United States. Well, to end my talk is, for example, the things that Mike said, Light and Athanasios, the issue of Venezuela. We have many, I read many, in the last 15 days, I collect many scenarios. I collect 20 different scenarios. But I was in Central America in 1989. What happened in Central America in that year? The invasion, the occupation, the military action of the United States in Panama. December 25 of 1989 was one of the most successful military operations of the US defense system in one country. In 10 days, they have Noriega. See, in 10 days. 3 months later, this day, the Panamanians are organizing new elections. I think this is the best scenario for the US, but Panama is not Venezuela, or Venezuela is not Panama. We talked with this with Mike the other day. I said, well, Panama is a little country, Venezuela is very big. Yes. But the last two military interventions of the United States in the continent, the Granada in 1983 and in Panama in 1989, were very successful. I share with Mike the idea that Panama is not Venezuela, Venezuela is not Panama. But the way that they do the things is very interesting to study for us. Only we are studying, reading, etc. But this issue, what happened, for example, if US made a strike in Venezuela? Our president, Claudia Sheinbaum, will talk a week, 2 weeks with Lula, talking against the action, talking about the sovereignty of the countries, etc., and that's it. Any other government in South America will do that because they are very close friends of the United States. And other countries in South America needs the promise of the US money helps for Donald Trump, for example, Argentina, or for example, Ecuador, or El Salvador, and right now, Honduras, etc. This will be the scenario for the next year. And what happens if the US don't do nothing in the military field? Well, he will strangulate the government of Maduro. For example, the issue of the oil and the doctors. Donald Trump can say, Claudia, you want free trade agreement? Stop the oil to Cuba, stop the doctors. And that's it. I think Marco Rubio talked this with the Mexican authorities under the table. I think. I don't know. But probably yes. And this is one of the scenarios. And there are many another scenarios in the case of the crisis in Venezuela. We hear many different versions, etc. The other day, a friend who had contact with the Air Force said, no, there is a plane in Caracas. If the family of Maduro wants to come to Mexico, this is strange, no? But could be real, the scenario, etc. We don't know, but there are between 15 and 20 different scenarios for the crisis in Venezuela, from the hard military action to the kind of negotiations or pressure to the maximum level, etc. Well, this is the synthesis of my thoughts with these issues. Mike, thank you for your question. I want to ask you, to Mike, one issue. The Trump corollary, we need an article right to June. Of the Trump's corollary. Oh, yeah, we need that. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Raúl. Many thanks, Raúl. Hemos escuchado pues comentarios de Yadira, Athanasios, Raúl, muy interesantes. Seguramente Mike tomó nota. Very interesting comments from Yadira, Athanasios, and Raúl. Mike has taken notes, but also we would like to open the questions, if you agree. Yeah, raise your hand, please, and introduce yourself before asking the question. Thank you. Also, from Arizona, I don't know, Esmeralda, if in the YouTube session they have questions, no? Okay. And out here in the in the audience here, any questions, any comments? No? Okay, then Mike, please, if you would like to answer the questions.
Okay. So I'll just talk about two quick things just from taking notes from this was, so there's a mention of like militarization, and I haven't had a lot of time this trip to talk to the National Guard folks, the Guardia Nacional. But I did do a study on like gendarmerie, carabinieri type forces. And so I think, Mexico is one of those countries with the current security situation where a gendarmerie type force would be good. So I have kind of high hopes for the Guardia Nacional, but it's going to come down to like execution as to whether they're going to do well at what they're doing or not. I think there's been just kind of this kind of never-ending change of like what security forces are going to be in Mexico. Like the police forces, like every sexenio, you get a new police force. But hopefully the National Guard will get enough time to get itself together and become a capable force that can span a spectrum of different types of conflict. So I think as far as militarization goes, like I'm hopeful that this kind of will be a police and also military kind of organization similar to what we've seen in Europe, but that won't be easy to do. So I'm hopefully that works. But I mean, there's a lot of, I won't get into the other stuff about how the military is doing all kinds of other tasks that are tied to civilian institutions and kind of the risks there. But I do think like the cartel capability, their ability to enact violence, their weapon systems requires forces that can answer that. And if the only thing that can do that is the military, then that's what you're going to have to use. So figuring out, Mexico needs to figure out like how it can engage in kind of law enforcement against these groups that are super powerful that need to be dealt with. There's a question about like when Athanasios was talking about the supply demand, arms and drugs thing, and the absence of shared responsibility and the blame exchange. I was thinking about it. I'll have to go back and look it up. But like with Merida, the Merida Initiative and the bicentennial framework, which I guess publicly I'll say that I think the bicentennial framework is a terrible naming convention, since the bicentennial history of our two countries is not always great. So I don't know if I would highlight. I think when I talk to anybody in Mexico, I like to talk about the future, because I think there's a lot to see that's helpful in the future, and I don't like to dwell on the past. But I think bicentennial was something to do with China and outside powers, and we've been here longer, and we have longer like relationships, but those aren't always good. Anyway, that's a side note. But Merida and the bicentennial framework, if you look at like the pillars, like it's all very like, what are we going to do in Mexico? Like what's going to happen in Mexico? How do we fix Mexico? But I don't know that we've ever had like Mexico say, hey, as we do this agreement, you need to reduce drug use by X percentage or something like that. Or like you need to reduce weapons. I mean, weapons have come up, but I mean, I feel like those agreements are very kind of one-sided for the most part. So with Mexican diplomacy, maybe a little more like, hey, if we're going to do this together, this is the demand side of it, and this is the supply side, and we're going to work on this together. But I don't know that we've gotten to that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think Merida is great. I think the bicentennial framework's fine. It's basically Merida repackaged. It seems like everyone's just repackaged Merida over time. They changed the names, Beyond Merida and all these things.
Do you think we need another bilateral agreement like Merida Initiative and Bicentennial, which substitute or replace that Bicentennial framework?
So I don't know what the Trump administration is doing about that. Now, Marco Rubio came down and he had the joint statement after his meeting with President Sheinbaum, and then they had a meeting of a high-level dialogue. But I don't know if, and there was something that came out of that, but I don't know if it's the same as like Merida Bicentennial framework. But I do think that's useful to have a standing framework that everybody's working through. And basically everybody at this point has been doing Merida, and they just changed the names and they keep doing the working groups and trying to keep it going. But it'd be interesting to see for shared responsibility, like, hey, US, like, what's your part in reducing demand? And how does Mexico hold the US responsible for it? And being at UNAM, UNAM has this major medical campus and all this stuff. And I'm like, I just thought about it sitting here listening to this was, well, is Mexico developing like treatment specialists and drug, demand reduction specialists that they can provide to the United States to help with in the United, like, what is Mexico? How can Mexico help with the demand problem in the United States besides attacking supply? I don't think any of those conversations happen. It's always very like, well, what can the U.S. give Mexico to help with supply? One other thing that caught my attention was with China is, and this is tied to the corollary issue, the Trump corollary. The way that this thing is structured is it's based on. I'll also look at that in a second. Let's see. So the question was, why do you think there's no willingness of the Mexican government to attack the flow of money in Mexico, and will that change over the next 3 years? But that's for Mr. Benítez. That's for Raúl, Dr. Benítez. So, because I don't have an answer for that. So, yeah. Okay, so let me finish my thought on the corollary piece though first. So I'll just close that part out. So the Roosevelt corollary, like after that happened, you have the OAS, you have this idea of the community comes together in a hemisphere and they work together, and that's how they deal with problems. Something that's unique that a lot of people in the United States don't understand is that this region is unique in that you haven't had balancing against the United States. Even though the United States is the dominant power in the region, economically, militarily, in realist theory, you'd think you'd see balancing with the countries in this region against the United States. Instead, you've seen this thing. Some scholars in the UK have talked about this as, Republican internationalism, where there's been these binding agreements, and the U.S. reduces or agrees not to conduct unilateral interventions, and because of that, you don't see balancing against the U.S. But if the U.S. starts violating this agreement and breaks this structure that's been put in place really since World War II and even before that, you open the door for outside powers to come in more than they are. And so you see like the OAS being sidelined. The Deputy Secretary of State came in and basically said, hey, if the OAS doesn't get on board, we're not going to support the OAS anymore. But if you look at what happened with like CELAC China, CELAC EU, CELAC is an institution that it deliberately excludes the United States and Canada from relations in the hemisphere. And so you're seeing like the countries, it might be slow or it might go fast. It kind of depends how the US policy goes, but the US risks breaking a system that's been very helpful. You can't go invade Iraq and Afghanistan and get involved everywhere else in the world if your hemisphere is starting to balance against you or seeking outside influence. So if the fear is like, well, we don't want China in the hemisphere, one of the fastest way to get more China in the hemisphere is to conduct unilateral action without consulting with your allies. And then I guess the last thing I'll say about I had this debate with Raúl at dinner the other night. Venezuela is not Panama. And if we look at unilateral strikes in Mexico, those are very complicated. And every time someone starts telling me, and having spent time in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think a lot of times people think, well, this will be easy. Anytime you start hearing people say this will be easy and this is going to go quickly, and every time troops are deployed, it's, well, they'll be back by Christmas. Anytime you use military force, you're rolling the iron dice and you don't know how this thing is going to end up. And so if the United States thinks that unilateral military action is going to solve all its problems in the hemisphere, you might get lucky. You might get Panama 1989. This thing goes great. You might not. You might find yourself in a decades-long counterinsurgency that you didn't plan on, or something might go totally sideways. So that's where deliberate planning and really thinking it through and making that risk assessment matters. But yeah, so you roll the iron dice if you do these things. So you might get Panama, might not. Okay.
Make the last comments to Athanasios, Yadira, and Raúl.
Okay. Yeah. On the question on money laundering, so it's a good thing my wife walked out, because my inside source on this is my brother-in-law, who's actually a VP for City Latam, and he's in charge of this. Boy, I hope he doesn't hear that I'm telling you people what happens. Now, without, and Raúl knows what I'm talking about very well. But I mean, the question was framed as why isn't Mexico doing? I think it's bilateral, and I think there's more that the U.S. can do. But I'm gonna describe to you what kind of seems to happen in Mexico based on what my friend, my contact has told me. So one of the problems in Mexico is there's a lack of communication between banks on the issue of fraudulent activity that's taking place that the banks themselves have identified. So Bank A identifies some kind of fraudulent activity that's taking place. What they're supposed to do under current law is that they're supposed to report that to the federal government, and then the federal government is supposed to handle the case along with the bank, and the other banks in the country also have to be informed of the fraudulent activity. Taking a really dumb example, you have an account that is just bringing up flags left, right, and center. What will happen in many other countries is exactly what I just described. They'll freeze the account. They'll inform the authorities. There'll be an investigation, but nobody can touch that money. What happens in Mexico in many instances is that they'll contact this person, they'll return the person the money, and tell that person to go away, but with this person's money. But they won't tell the federal government, because if they do, then they'll get in trouble. They think they'll get in trouble, and they certainly won't tell other banks, because they don't want. I mean, it's about perceptions, and it's about what the reaction might be on the part of the federal government with regards to having these accounts. What's going to happen to X bank in Mexico if the federal government investigates what's been going on within that bank as far as these kinds of issues are concerned? So they tend to keep quiet. So there's a lack of communication between the different banks in the country, and between the different banks in the country and the federal authorities. So, on the issue of the specific issue of money laundering, go back 150. Well, I guess it's 140 years. How did they bring down Capone? They brought down Capone with money. So, I mean, it's the argument that I keep on insisting that if you go after the money, it's going to make such a significant difference, and is much more likely to work than the strategies that the two countries have been using in the last multiple decades. And going after the money, sure, the U.S. administration now has been specifically targeting companies in Mexico that may have some kind, or individuals that may have some kind of financial association with cartels. But that's not enough. I mean, they're not looking internally too much, from what I understand as well. The whole approach to dealing with the money laundering issue needs to be rethought, but it needs to be rethought in a bilateral, shared manner, because the cartels are a bilateral problem. It's not a Mexican problem. It's not a exclusively U.S. problem. It's a bilateral problem. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Athanasios. Please, Yadira, please.
I agree with Saki. It's about the money, but it is not only the money. I think that it is not only the money. I'm switched to Spanish. Súper rápido. Es que no solamente es el tema del dinero, sino también el nivel de penetración y de capacidades que tienen estas organizaciones criminales para controlar a México. Y entonces tiene que tomar una decisión política, decidir si los designa como terroristas con la finalidad de conseguir mejores condiciones para un trato con Estados Unidos y además dar un paso adelante, porque efectivamente usan terror, tienen capacidades armamentísticas y estamos en una guerra irregular e híbrida, pero no se reconoce. Y del otro lado decimos que estamos en un proceso de pacificación. Entonces, también tiene que tomar una decisión política y eso pasa por entregar peces gordos. Que, Raúl, you are talking about it in a lot of forums, but this kind of complexities. Y la presidenta va a tener que enfrentarse a eso en el marco de la reconstrucción de tanto el sistema de seguridad en México como en la relación con Estados Unidos. Y también creo que it's true, Venezuela is not Panama. Y el tema aquí es justo que Maduro tiene demasiadas alianzas y demasiadas capacidades. Y no va a ser tan fácil. Lamentablemente, el tema de la dictadura y de todo lo que ha hecho al interior de Venezuela, incluyendo el control que tiene sobre las Fuerzas Armadas y los acuerdos que tiene con actores extrarregionales, como claramente son Rusia e Irán, y el papel que juega Venezuela dentro del tablero geopolítico mundial. Entonces, aquí yo creo que Trump is thinking about an agreement with Maduro in order to let the country, but I don't really know. Y en ese sentido, pues, yo creo que es incierto el futuro de Venezuela, pero lo cierto es que no podemos dejar de denunciar la dictadura y la violación de los derechos humanos que suceden al interior del país y de ser solidarios con todas las personas de Venezuela que están fuera de sus hogares y fuera de sus casas, extrañando también su tierra por las condiciones en las que viven. Gracias.
Sí, brevemente, un comentario sobre México, Estados Unidos y la política interna de los países el próximo año. Donald Trump va a dar un viraje rápido porque tiene la intención de ganar las elecciones de medio término en noviembre. Eso es lógico. Y él sabe que no, Donald Trump no, es muchas cosas, pero tonto no es. Es un gran pragmático que tiene un olfato muy grande para dar cambios muy rápidos, que ha perdido parte de la comunidad latina con el tema migratorio y que tiene que dar un cambio para tratar de atraer otra vez a la comunidad latina, porque parte de la comunidad que le dio el triunfo en las elecciones donde ganó fue con la comunidad latina. Entonces eso lo va a tener en cuenta. Y en el caso mexicano, México no puede intervenir en la política interna de Estados Unidos porque no tiene poder. Ni siquiera influye en la opinión política de los latinos, ni de los mexicanos en Estados Unidos. Pero Estados Unidos sí puede intervenir en la política interna mexicana. En primer lugar, porque hay que tener en cuenta que aún con el Tratado de Libre Comercio, la economía de México está parada, está frozen, completamente congelada. Y un país que no tiene tratados de libre comercio como lo tiene México, como Brasil, que es la competencia eterna de México en América Latina entre México y Brasil. Brasil y México hace 30 años tenían el mismo Producto Interno Bruto. Hoy Brasil le gana a México 20%. Brasil, sin tratado de libre comercio, creció más que México. ¿Por qué? Hay que ver eso. Porque multilateralizó todas sus alianzas y sus opciones. Entonces, multilateralizó sus relaciones con la India, con China, con Corea, todo eso. México no tiene ninguna opción de esas, porque no las quiso desarrollar. Y entonces solo tiene la puerta de Estados Unidos. Y Claudia sabe que si no hace lo que Estados Unidos quiere, Trump puede decirle, bueno, aquí se acabaron las conversaciones y quédate sin tratado de libre comercio, haz como quieras. Y se van los inversionistas. Y luego el gobierno de la 4T, no Claudia, el gobierno de la 4T es especialista en ahuyentar inversiones extranjeras. O sea, el pleito que tuvo México con España y con Austria no tiene lógica, no tiene lógica. O sea, yo no le encuentro ninguna lógica a pelearse con el tercer inversionista más importante del mundo en México, que es España, y con otro país europeo. Además, la Unión Europea actúa como bloque. Entonces, Si España es agredido por México en términos económicos e incluso en el discurso político diplomático, la Unión Europea cacha esos mensajes y pues no los quiere. España es parte de la Unión Europea. Y con Austria pasa lo mismo, o sea, andarse peleando por un penacho que los austriacos cuidan bien. Está bien, pero que eso no perjudique las relaciones con ese país y con la Unión Europea. Entonces, lo mismo pasa con América del Sur. Pelearse por dos asilados condenados en su país, bueno, una asilada y un asilado, bien tratados por la justicia de su país porque tenían libertad de movimiento, no estaban presos en una cárcel, tenían libertad y rompen relaciones los dos países. Y encima, cosa que nunca salió en la prensa mexicana, el gobierno de Ecuador le ganó la demanda en La Haya, la primera instancia de la demanda en La Haya, a México. Eso es una vergüenza para la diplomacia mexicana que no la dicen, pero sucedió. Entonces, el gobierno de Ecuador ganó la demanda. México no puede estar jugando con leyes internacionales como la ley de asilo con tanta flexibilidad porque pierde los casos y se queda sin relaciones. Y ahora resulta que esos dos gobiernos están en la misma tendencia, en contra de las tendencias de México, en el escenario latinoamericano y sudamericano. Entonces, ¿qué le queda a México? Estados Unidos. Pero resulta que tampoco saben leer la política de Estados Unidos, pero no de Estados Unidos gobierno, de Estados Unidos capitalistas, inversionistas, empresarios. La reforma judicial. Esa reforma judicial está congelando las inversiones extranjeras en México, y no solo las de Estados Unidos, las de Corea, las de Singapur, las de Japón, las de China, todas, porque los inversionistas no tienen estabilidad judicial ni certeza judicial. Si tienen un pleito con una empresa mexicana, ¿quién va a decidir? Si un juez que no sabe nada de comercio, pero sí tiene línea política que hacer, ¿ok? Entonces, es un problema. Lo que, pues, por ejemplo, los automóviles chinos. ¿Qué tal si el gobierno de México le sube los impuestos y las empresas chinas se defienden y un juez pues, actúa en contra de las empresas chinas porque tiene que quedar bien con Estados Unidos y México? Se cayeron esas inversiones chinas por la reforma judicial. Entonces, todos esos escenarios son posibles, todos son posibles. Y por último, solo quiero decir una cosa, porque que es muy importante para el tema de defensa y seguridad de los dos países, México y Estados Unidos. En los dos países las fronteras son súper vulnerables. Así como a México entra la cocaína del sur y entran las armas del norte, a Estados Unidos entra la cocaína desde México, el fentanilo desde México, etcétera. Estados Unidos también tiene muy poca capacidad de controlar su frontera. Y entonces los estadounidenses consumen mucha cocaína, mucho fentanilo y un montón de otras drogas. Entonces, no tienen control de la frontera. Y México no tiene control en doble dirección de la frontera. No controla ni lo que entra ni lo que sale. O sea, México no controla lo que entra por las aduanas, sino controla lo que sale por las carreteras. Estados Unidos solo no controla lo que entra. Y lo que sale, que son las armas a México, no las quiere controlar por sus leyes, porque esas leyes tienen 400 años, se dan desde la época de los ingleses. O sea, la ley del control de armas, de permitir a la gente la autodefensa, pues era la ley de los colonos para poder conquistar tierras. En México nos preciamos de la ley del petróleo, que es de 1938, y todo el mundo en México dice, esa ley no se mueve. Bueno, ¿cómo vamos a mover una ley en Estados Unidos que tiene 400 años? Eso es imposible. Pero eso hace que no controlen la salida de armas los estadounidenses. Y tampoco quieren, pues es natural, o sea, se pueden comprar armas y vender armas en ese país porque así desde hace 400 años está estipulado y está en la cultura de la gente. Entonces, pues es un problema muy grave para el libre comercio, pero también para la seguridad. Y hay una cosa que no controlan los dos gobiernos, y con eso termino. Las nuevas armas que se han probado en Israel y Gaza y en Rusia y Ucrania, los drones, los misiles, todo sin personas manejándolo. Entonces, pues hay una guerra de misiles, hay una guerra de drones que hace 4 años, 3 años no existía. Ahora los carteles están compre drones como locos. Entonces, hasta estos drones chiquitos que venden en las tiendas Best Buy ahí en la frontera norte de Estados Unidos sirven para cruzar 1 kilo de cocaína, 2 kilos. Hay drones que cargan hasta 100 kilos. Pues metes un migrante y ya no pasa por el muro, vuela. Entonces, bueno,
Bueno,
eso son escenarios. Bueno, muchas gracias por todo.
gracias, Raúl. Bueno, muy interesante todos los comentarios. El tiempo pues se nos está a punto de agotarse. Yo pues les agradezco mucho su atención. I really appreciate your attention. Y bueno, quisiéramos darle la voz a May para que clausure esta mesa redonda, the fourth annual U.S.-Mexico Defense and Security Roundtable.
No, thank you. Just thank you so much again to UNAM, to everybody here for attending, everybody online that attended. I think this is a very important, bilateral relationships are so important here. And as I said in the beginning, the Consorcio between the University of Arizona and UNAM is just one of those things that helps us come together. And I think in times where politically things are difficult and where people have trouble getting together to talk about problems, things like this are an opportunity to do that. And so again, thank you so much for having me. And I actually learned quite a bit here, and I'll be harassing Raúl about some of his points and also Saki later. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you to everyone that signed in online. I really appreciate it.
Muchas gracias, Mike. Y un anuncio finalmente, en la parte posterior tenemos un código QR para que por favor guarden sus datos y reciban una constancia de asistencia a esta conferencia. Muchas gracias.